Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. Suddenly, it is the final weekend of January, and suddenly Jim Knowles is Penn State's new defensive coordinator. We've got a lot to catch up on this episode of the podcast. Ohio State's defensive coordinator, less than a month removed from helping the Buckeyes win a national championship down in Atlanta, is making the move to Happy Valley as Penn State's defensive play caller. Jim Knowles, long been someone high on James Franklin's list for this kind of an opportunity. Becomes the highest paid coordinator in college football history, as far as we understand it, north of $3 million per year on an annual salary for Jim Knowles to make this move from Ohio State. He spent 3 years as defensive coordinator with the Buckeyes. Before that, 4 seasons as defensive coordinator with a lot of success for Oklahoma State. His history goes back to Duke, Ole Miss, Western Michigan, Cornell back in the 1980s. And he's going to bring quite a track record and quite a storyline to Happy Valley for this 2025 year that certainly has all-in vibes. We've talked about that several times here recently about the roster ramifications of all the retention that has happened, guys that have decided not to enter the portal to look for something else, not to go to the NFL draft to become pros just yet. What that says about Penn State's locker room culture here going into another year, what it says about their NIL capabilities. We just learned something else about what James Franklin, Pat Kraft have at their disposal as well. They got some bank. We're going to get perspective from Columbus on this move for Penn State. Obviously, there's ramifications across college football. No more felt than over there for the Ohio State Buckeyes. Patrick, I know you were hoping you'd catch your breath just for a moment after covering the season all the way down to the wire in Atlanta last week, but college football has a way of bringing the offseason fast and furious. Welcome to yours. Welcome to your own defensive coordinator search. And welcome back to the Lions 24/7 podcast to talk about one of the splashier moves we've seen across the Big Ten and really the college football landscape in terms of assistant coach maneuvering in recent memory.
Yeah, absolutely. I think every time we've seen, the last big wild thing, whether it be transfer portal, NIL, guys leaving to play against the team that they played for in conference. Now you see a major assistant coach, a defensive coordinator, flipping from one Big Ten school to another in Jim Knowles. So, look, I should just stop being surprised by how these things happen and when they happen, too, because as you mentioned, I get to the Ohio State celebration. And obviously, you and I had been talking. We'd known that this was a definite possibility heading into the weekend. But you get there and the team comes out and Jim Knowles is not there. And it's like, oh, this may happen today. Like, this is so, as soon as that was over, it's like, let's get to work. Let's make sure. And obviously, shortly after the celebration ended was when the news started to filter out. So, it's been wild. But, I'm interested to see how this all plays out, especially given that these two teams do play each other next year.
Yeah, the 59-year-old Philadelphia native joins James Franklin's staff again less than a week after getting to the mountaintop of college football. His defense played a huge role. We saw that firsthand here in Happy Valley. First time Penn State and an Andy Kotelnicki offense didn't score a touchdown in years. It was the poorest performance we saw from this offense on the season, and again comes against an Ohio State defense led by Jim Knowles, as they have been the last few years. The only team that really had a lot of sustained success against Tyler Warren, though he came to life during that last Nittany Lions drive. We'll talk about Knowles, his scheme, what we think might transition over from Columbus in a moment. But Patrick, who, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this, covers Ohio State. We've had him on a bunch, so he's a familiar face to me, maybe not to everyone out there listening or watching. Patrick Murphy covers Ohio State, has done that for years with our 24/7 sports network over at bucknuts.com. Again, he was with them every step of the way during their journey from spring ball to the national title game, and he's been covering Jim Knowles since he got over to Ohio State back in 2022. So, Patrick, last week, I don't know if you were on your way to Atlanta or if you're already in Atlanta, I said, are you hearing some smoke about Jim Knowles coming to Penn State? Because we had both been hearing it about Oklahoma.
Right.
But at that point, there was a lot of focus on DeAnton Lynn for Penn State, some buzz around Brian Haynes, defensive coordinator for Indiana. Going into this past week, we heard some about NFL assistants being involved there. But ultimately, one name that kind of just kept, kind of showing up on the background and could be dismissed was Jim Knowles. And by the time we got to midweek into Wednesday, Thursday, that was really ramping up. And I was surprised. I told you, I'm looking around, I'm digging around in Columbus and nationally, and everyone's telling me, oh, it's Oklahoma, it's Ohio State, not hearing much on Penn State. And I'm here in Happy Valley, and I'm like, well, I'm hearing a lot on Penn State and Jim Knowles. And eventually, it must have been stealth mode for James Franklin. We're going to get more intel on this in the days ahead. We'll eventually have a press conference, I think, with James Franklin and Jim Knowles pretty soon. But Patrick, this one really kind of crept up on us in terms of Penn State being the primary player, whereas it seemed like everyone was bracing themselves for an Oklahoma Sooners, Ohio State Buckeyes battle. Lo and behold, it is a team that Ohio State faced this season, will face again next season. And these are two teams jockeying for position in the college football playoff conversation.
I was in Atlanta, and this obviously became a bigger topic of conversation, mostly on the Oklahoma side, as you mentioned. But people I kept talking to, whether it was other Ohio State beat writers, some of our national guys that were down there, even people on our message boards, as this is becoming a bigger topic of conversation. Like, as much as some of the Oklahoma stuff didn't make sense, there was a fiance connection who still lives down there. Things like that, like, okay, well, if he's going to leave Ohio State for personal reasons, there's not much you can do about that, right? And then, as you mentioned, the Penn State, you and I were talking to other people, like Penn State's name kept coming up. And that was one, I think if you talk to Buckeye fans, they're still confused exactly what was the incentive to leave Ohio State for Penn State coming off a national championship and everything you mentioned. I think ultimately it comes down to what the Nittany Lions were willing to give Jim Knowles, both financially and in terms of control of this defense, something that he had more of in the second half of Ohio State's season after they lost out at Oregon and gave up 32 points and almost 500 yards of total offense. But with Larry Johnson, who obviously Penn State fans will know well, you kind of are forced to play a certain way. He is very much a traditional 4-down lineman guy. You very rarely see the Buckeyes and Penn State when he was there move out of that, right? And so that made Jim Knowles have to alter a lot of what he was doing in terms of the way they would get pressure and using kind of a hybrid player and things like that. And I think the opportunity to go to Penn State and do more of the stuff he did at Oklahoma State, the stuff he did at Duke, plus the money that you mentioned off the top, was incentive enough to say, look, I'm going to go out on top at Ohio State and face another challenge here. It was something he told us originally when he got to Columbus was this is probably going to take 2 to 3 years to build. This was year 3, and obviously the best of his defenses he had in Columbus. So I do think he enjoys the process of figuring out the best way to do this at a new program. He's bounced around quite a bit throughout his career, and this will be another one. And he walks into obviously a good situation, right, with the talent that Penn State has and the success that they were able to have under Tom Allen. So, I think that probably too. It'd be one thing if it had been a situation where Penn State's defense had been shaky all year and he was going to have to really rebuild it. No, he's got good pieces to step in and get it moving in the right direction pretty quickly.
When you look at what Ohio State accomplished defensively in 2024, number 1 in scoring defense, number 1 in total defense nationally, number 3 in run defense, under 90 yards allowed per game on the ground, number 3 in pass defense, less than 170 yards allowed per game through the air. And obviously that's a heck of a balance. That's a recipe that will win you a lot of games. But the question for me is a little bit, why would you walk away for that situation? And that's the question for a lot of people, right? And we're going to get a chance to speak with Jim Knowles ourselves, and we'll see how transparent he chooses to be about this move for himself. But
not very, I promise you that.
Thank you. I look forward to that. But when we look at motivational factors for a move like this, you're not leaving to become a head coach. You are leaving to become the highest paid coordinator, but let's not pretend that they're broke there in Columbus. We know that's not the case. He was going to be highly paid regardless, probably the highest paid coordinator in history, no matter which of these options he was going to choose. But when you talk about him picking up his bags, packing them, and heading east to a team that is going to be on that schedule next year, leaving a locker room, leaving a defensive room of guys that he had a hand in bringing to campus, and he had a hand in helping become stars. He had a hand in them becoming national champions, and ultimately not being present at the celebration on campus on Sunday. Not exactly the storybook ending for his time in Columbus. So when we put that all together, how much of this was a personal decision where clearly maybe things just weren't sitting right with him about where he was in his dynamics on the staff or in Columbus? And how much of this is simply cashing in at the right time when you find yourself as the hottest commodity in college football?
I'd say it's a mix of the two. I think, you know, we've reported, other outlets have reported, going back to, even before this season, that he and Larry Johnson haven't seen eye to eye. Maybe even, and I don't know this to be true, but I've heard this from other reporters that they've heard, even to the point of disliking each other. It's one thing to have different philosophies and things like that, and you got to figure it out. So if that's true, obviously that makes it a more difficult work environment. I was standing in between their two families when Ohio State won the Cotton Bowl. Larry Johnson and Jim Knowles, kind of off to the side of the stage that they set up there, and there was little to no interaction between the groups. Now, again, read into that what you want. So I think that's a part of it. I think, if there were issues with Ryan Day and maybe his involvement with how much Jim Knowles has a say of the whole defense, I could see that certainly playing a part. But I think also, he was the hottest name, right? You had two big programs going after him. I imagine if this had strung out longer, or if he'd been available quicker, that other programs might have been involved as well, looking to kind of capitalize on the success. Even if Ohio State hadn't won the national championship, the defense obviously what was still a key catalyst in any success the Buckeyes had this year. So I think that the timing works out really well if you're going to make a move, if you're not entirely content. And, the money is good, right? And as you said, Ohio State was going to pay him certainly well. Jim Knowles had just signed a new contract last offseason, so he was already being compensated. I think he was at $2.2 million, something around there. And Ohio State, the reports were that he was willing to, or that they were willing to make him the highest paid coordinator in the country. But I do think that the numbers from Oklahoma and from Penn State were greater. And, again, you would do this for so long, the opportunity to maximize that. And, he's getting married again. From my understanding, at least from what has kind of been put out there, the woman that he is engaged to has kids. So, obviously you're thinking down the line, this is money that could help change not only the lives of him and his future wife, but her children and whatnot as they become part of his family. So I think there's a lot to it. I think we'll probably get more as we get closer. I do expect whenever Jim does talk to you guys, and by the way, I have always enjoyed his press conferences. He really gives a lot of thought to his answers, and he has dry humor, but there is some humor in there. But I don't think he will probably say anything that will, cause any issues at Ohio State. I think he'll probably want to keep it, let's look forward, and, the time at Ohio State was good and whatnot is kind of what I expect, but we'll see. He's surprised me before. Maybe he will want to, maybe we'll stir the pot a little bit.
We will do our best to get some headline-worthy comments out of him when we get that chance. Don't worry about that. When I talked about Ohio State's defensive success in 2024. It's like you said, it's not coming to a reclamation project here. Was it quite as elite as it was under Manny Diaz the year before? Probably not. But this was one of the top-ranked defenses in the country in its own right. Top 10 in rush defense, number 9. Further behind, certainly, than Ohio State in pass defense at the end of the season, number 31 overall, but still less than 200 yards allowed per game. Number 7 in total defense, number 8 in scoring defense. Those were two that I mentioned. Ohio State was number 1 overall. And so we've heard this before. I think we'll hear it again from James Franklin when he lays out his rationale for this decision-making. He doesn't want somebody to show up here and push the blow-up button and start from scratch. He has a lot of confidence in his staff. As we understand it, Anthony Poindexter is sticking around as safeties coach. Right. Terry Smith has been here for 12 years now, cornerbacks coach. Deion Barnes has really laid a lot of groundwork as defensive line coach. Dan Conner is highly respected in the linebackers room. And they've got a lot of guys who've done a lot on the field already defensively from a playing standpoint. But are there some calling cards that we should expect for Jim Knowles as he comes here and starts to really put his mark on this defensive group that may not be apparent come spring game, but that we'll see show up next September?
He will run a version of the 4-2-5. And like I said, he likes to have the hybrid. He called it a jack in Columbus. He called it a Leo, I think, at Oklahoma State. But a hybrid defensive end linebacker that, you can move around. And I know Penn State's done some of that. Something you didn't see a lot of being done in Columbus because of some of the stuff I mentioned earlier. 2 linebackers, which when he came to Ohio State was a change. They'd been playing with 3 predominantly before then. And then, he calls it a safety driven defense. That includes the nickel, which, went through some variations during his time in Columbus in terms of the players that were operating that. But I think Jordan Hancock this past season kind of fit exactly what he wanted, as a former cornerback who was able to do some safety things, even played some deep safety at times. It helped to have a player like Caleb Downs who can move around that defense and do a lot of different things. But yeah, he wants to have the ability to cover. He will go to heavier sets when needed. We saw that a lot in the Big Ten, when they played, the Iowas of the world and whatnot, some 3 linebacker stuff. But yeah, the base will be that 4-2-5 with a hybrid defensive end, and the secondary is really important. And I think you mentioned the safeties coach saying like those two getting aligned will be vital. And I think I saw that they've already had conversations and whatnot. So I think that's important for the success. Ohio State brought back Matt Guerreri, who had worked with Jim Knowles previously at Duke and then had been the co-defensive coordinator at Indiana, and had been a GA at Ohio State when Knowles first got here. As the safeties coach, that's a guy who he knows very well. And so it's important. The whole secondary is vital for them. I think the pieces certainly play a part, but the schematic stuff that they want to do, some combination, but mostly man. There will be some zone in there as well. But it's about figuring out ways to get pressure. He's an aggressive play caller, sometimes to the detriment of Ohio State. If you think back to the Ohio State game against Georgia in the Peach Bowl a couple of years ago, some of those big plays Georgia hit was because he brought pressure and it didn't get home and things like that. But Knowles has said that if you can limit, when he first got to Ohio State, it was between 3 and 5 to hold teams to 3 to 5 explosive plays a game. I think that probably worked better at Oklahoma State than it did when you started to play a more national schedule, so to speak, at Ohio State. And I think Penn State will be the same, but there are some ability to hit teams, but for the most part, especially once he got his guys and everyone kind of understood the scheme, the pressure that they were able to bring the second half of this season and through the playoff, kind of neutralized a lot of that. And then players were more comfortable in coverage and things like that. So it'll take some time, but he certainly knows what he's doing. And the scheme has been successful, at different stops at different levels. And I don't see any reason why it won't be at Penn State as well.
Let's go back to that jack roll if you don't mind, because
Yeah.
Tom Allen's kind of wild card piece on the defense, because they ran a 4-2-5 similarly, but they got that other component more from the defensive backfield. It was more of a hybrid linebacker / safety / slot corner kind of deal. It ultimately started out with safety Jalen Reed. It landed in the hands of Zion Tracy by the end of the season, that line role. So what you're describing, those guys are not that. They're still going to have roles. We're going to see a lot of defensive backs involved. But essentially what you're saying is more of we don't have him anymore, but Abdul Carter sounds like someone who would have been at the pinnacle of what you'd want from that position. But that's what we're talking about here, someone who has ideally that level of range. When you're coaching at Ohio State, now Penn State, you'd think you have some of those guys within your weaponry. They're going to have to sort through what they have on this roster from an edge rusher standpoint. But we're thinking more edge rusher, guy who's going to be disruptive near the line of scrimmage versus someone who's going to be playing in space, because that's more of what the 4-2-5 with that line role looked like for us in 2024 as we navigated our way through that defense under Tom Allen.
Yes, exactly. And Ohio State tried a few different guys in that role. Defensive end Jack Sawyer did it his sophomore season, and it just didn't work. He wasn't, he'd been a pass rusher. He wasn't really able to take on some of the additional responsibilities when you do kind of drop into more of a linebacker role, having to cover. Mitchell Melton was a defensive end who played it a little bit. So yeah, it's certainly more of a lineman. The way Jim Knowles has described it, and I actually wrote a story I can send to you if people are interested. But like it started as a position where at some of those schools like Duke, when he was at Cornell, some of the smaller schools he was at, they were able to identify guys that weren't getting recruited because they didn't really have a position, but they were elite athletes. And, they were able to bring them in and kind of fit them into this hybrid role. So it doesn't always have to be a defensive end. I think that's kind of more what it's morphed into over the years. But the one thing I thought, and this kind of played out to be the case, is when you're at Ohio State, when you're at Penn State, do you necessarily need that position as much as you might at Duke or at an Oklahoma State when you're trying to create some sort of matchup things? I think that we saw when it did work at Ohio State, it was better as a change of pace type of situation, as more than he had it on the field almost all the time by the end at Oklahoma State. I think it was Malcolm Rodriguez, if I'm not mistaken, who did it, who now is, I believe, on the Detroit Lions and playing well. So it is a guy that can do some different things, but it has been more of a guy with experience playing defensive end who is also athletically and mentally able to kind of handle some of different stuff, dropping into coverage and things like that. Maybe covering, a tight end or stuff along that line. Honestly, though, we didn't see it enough in Columbus that I can tell you for sure, like, what his true vision would be at this level, just because they never really fully deployed it, which, again, going back to our earlier conversation, I think is part of the reason he's making the move. So we'll see if it comes to fruition at Penn State, because everyone here was always like, when are we going to see it? Who's it going to be? Like that type of thing. And it just never really played out completely.
I think, I know it's a bitter moment right now in Columbus, but you can't review this journey for the Ohio State Buckeyes without acknowledging what their defense did along the way, what Jim Knowles did. And I think about, as much as they were pouring on the points in the playoffs, they limited Oregon and that high-octane offense to 8 points in the first half. They didn't let Oregon score a point until they had, 4 touchdowns on the board that day in the Rose Bowl. Tennessee only managed 14 points, and they put the game away with a defensive touchdown late when the Longhorns were on the doorstep. You had Notre Dame being held in check, 15 points going into the fourth quarter, 7 points for the first half. And so as you put that all together, how do you think the legacy of Jim Knowles will age in Columbus? Is it going to be the architect of a national championship defense, or is it going to be more of a Benedict Arnold role and the guy who proved to be a traitor and ultimately is going to be wearing that Penn State logo in 2025 and beyond?
I think it'll depend on how things go at Penn State, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if he gets that defense playing it at the high level really quickly, and obviously Penn State has to find some receivers, and the offense there's obviously questions on that side of the ball as well. But if it's like up and running and Ohio State's defense isn't as good next couple years, yeah, I think there'll probably be some animosity. With that said, I've seen a lot of people on our message board, social media, people I talk to, friends of mine that are Buckeye fans, that do recognize like what he did here. Right now, there's definitely hard feelings in the moment, because it's like, man, there's an opportunity here. They're gonna lose a lot of guys, but there's an opportunity because these guys have been in the system and know Jim Knowles well. There's an opportunity to sort of build this back up quickly. Now everything's kind of shift under a new defensive coordinator. But I do think ultimately, once kind of the emotions are taken out of it, people will remember Jim Knowles fondly. I mean, if you look at what Ohio State was doing defensively in the 2 seasons prior to Jim Knowles' arrival, it was not pretty. So he got the Buckeyes back to what people around Columbus call the Silver Bullets, playing that way. And now the new defensive coordinator, whoever that may be, will have a good foundation to build off of. But again, I do think what happens going forward will probably create perception, but there's no doubt he was a important part to a national championship, and I think Buckeye fans will ultimately remember that as well.
It was an unfair question for me to ask in January
2025,
and we will pick it back up on this podcast maybe in 2026, 2027. We'll definitely do it in the fall, because you're always the guy we bring on from Bucknuts leading up to that battle, and we'll see where those teams stand when they meet in the fall, and you get the whole Jim Knowles versus the Buckeyes storyline. But let me ask you this, and we'll finish here, because I know a lot of our listeners, a lot of our viewers are probably really, really enjoying a moment where it feels like Penn State has kind of put the Buckeyes on their heels a little bit. It's been a while since there was that sense here in Happy Valley, on the field, off the field. So it's late in January. Ohio State certainly has plenty of talent on the defensive side of the ball, but Jim Knowles is going to get to work his way through a pretty cupcake non-conference schedule before they face Oregon in late September. Texas is the opening matchup for Ohio State. And a lot of people think it's either one of those two teams, maybe Penn State as the number 1 team in the country. How concerned are you about Ohio State's defense being where it needs to be in 2025 because Jim Knowles is no longer there?
I think it was always going to be a concern. As I mentioned, they're losing their entire starting defensive line, losing a starting middle linebacker, cornerback, safety and nickel. They did get back Davis and Igbinosun at corner, so that's helpful, and Sonny Styles at linebacker. But it was always going to be, a question throughout the offseason of like, how is this defense going to be, whether Jim Knowles was the defensive coordinator or not. And then you have Texas coming in and Arch Manning and the receivers and things like that Texas will have. So I think there was going to be concern no matter what. I think up until that game, we'll probably be talking about what this defense looks like, and that would have been the case regardless. It's an interesting matchup to open the season, especially given these two teams just played in the college football playoff semifinal, right? So we'll probably start to see more of that, assuming these games continue in the regular season. But yeah, I think this defense will be under a microscope all season. Frankly, this whole team, because even offensively, they're losing quite a bit as well in terms of key pieces. So it's not. It's more like the Michigan situation than like Georgia a couple years ago, where a lot of those guys came back. I don't expect Ohio State to fall off as much as Michigan did this past season, but there could be some early bumps in the road. But as we saw this season, you have a little more leeway, right? You can lose a game, 2 games, get in the playoff, and then see what happens. Both these teams obviously were able to do that, and I think you hope that the defense can kind of come along from an Ohio State perspective throughout the season. I think similarly with Penn State, frankly, because I do think it'll take some time. I think they're probably in a better spot than when Jim Knowles took over at Ohio State, but it does, learning him. I think the personalities, as I mentioned, with him and working with his players will take a little bit of time. But I think it is, like I said, a good foundation for them, and there is that room for potential error if you need it. Obviously, you hope not to with the new format.
Well, it's quite a journey for Jim Knowles, the guy who played at Cornell and got his coaching start there in the Ivy League. And he was the head coach at Cornell for a 60-game span. And now here he is, the most buzzed about man in the Big Ten as we finish out January 2025. Hope you're getting some rest. Long season for all of us. We were 1 week short of getting to the finish line. You made it there in Atlanta. Great coverage from you all year. And it's going to be a heck of an offseason in Columbus, just like it is here. And we will see you down the road, my friend.
Sounds good. Good talk with you, Tyler.
All right. Great stuff from Patrick Murphy. As always, you can catch out his content over at bucknuts.com here within our 24/7 Sports Network. Very grateful to be able to tap into our team of reporters at the team beat level across the Big Ten and beyond here at 24/7 Sports. And we're able to do that during the coaching search the last couple of weeks. And that's where I said it was confounding sometimes because we'd be hearing things here locally. And this is going back to like the day that Tom Allen's let go, or not let go, the day that Tom Allen decides to move on. Jim Knowles' name is being at least whispered about that week. But of course, D'Anton Lynn is the name that's being shouted from the mountaintops, and USC gets an extension for him. They keep him on board in Los Angeles. And very quickly, when Ohio State finishes things up, they lift that trophy. There was a little bit of downtime that following Tuesday morning, 6 days ago. But come Tuesday afternoon, you were starting to hear that drumbeat again, that Knowles could be in play. By the time we got to Thursday, it felt like he was definitely in play. And we confirmed that with some sources here in Happy Valley that they were working. There was some, I think, concern within Happy Valley and some of the leadership group here that maybe they were just being used to drive up the price from an agent perspective. But by the time we got to Friday, there was optimism that this was a deal that would get done come Sunday, and there it was. And Monday morning, we got the official announcement from Penn State. So this thing has a bow on it, and Tyler Calvaruso didn't wait until things got official. He was already talking to recruits across the region, across the country about this really splashy move for Penn State. So we appreciate him for joining us here on the Lions 24/7 podcast. Tyler, welcome back.
Yeah, man, it's been a whirlwind of 24 hours. It's been very interesting to pick the brains of some of these recruits after this hire. It's big time. No doubt about it. And a lot of the kids feel the same exact way.
You and I are going to dive into a new commitment for Penn State. They had a lot going on from a recruiting angle on campus this past weekend. You did a phenomenal job covering it, along with Brian Doan and other members of our coverage team at Lions 24/7. But before we do that, we have to address this big move for Penn State. And what was the overarching, I guess, theme from these conversations that you had with Nittany Lions defensive targets, Nittany Lions defensive commits, about what they just heard? I know it was fresh to them, but you were in there. You were speaking with them as we were all kind of digesting the news on Sunday.
Yeah, a good amount of them actually found out the news from me, so that was a pretty funny across while I was doing all of this. But first things first is pedigree. A lot of guys brought up, national championship winning D coordinator. That can only help to elevate Penn State's defense moving forward. Some guys praise the scheme. They see a fit. They like the way Knowles gets after it on defense. They could see their skill sets playing in that kind of a system. Really just overall excitement. A lot of recruits are really fired up, especially the commits. They're looking forward to meeting Knowles, getting to know Knowles really throughout the spring, whenever they could get on campus. And that goes for the targets as well. They want to get around Knowles, see what he's like, see what the fit is in his defense, see what his coaching style is truly like. Because some of these guys haven't even gotten the chance to meet Knowles in any capacity. Some are being pursued or were being pursued by Ohio State at some point. So there's, an ever so little bit of familiarity, but majority have yet to meet Knowles. That's going to change for a lot of them this spring.
This is an industry where when you have success, people want to take a piece of the pie, right? And yet here we are working our way toward February. And, if something happens now, I'll get called a jinx for this, but it sure looks like Penn State's coaching staff is going to remain largely in place. Now, there's always some staff movement, but when we talk about the key figures, your offensive coordinator, we know West Virginia came calling for Andy Kotelnicki in November into December. He's going to be year 2 offensive coordinator. Jim Knowles is the big new addition on campus, but Tyler, you look across and whether it's Jaywan Sider continuing his career, Terry Smith in the cornerbacks room, Deion Barnes, really cultivating himself and growing more roots as the position coach in the defensive line room, Phil Troutwine with that turnaround culturally in that room. When you consider what James Franklin has been able to avoid, which is getting poached by teams within the Big Ten, beyond the Big Ten, and having to fill a bunch of different holes. They lost Tom Allen, but then look what they did to answer in the response. How is that playing with recruits? I don't think anyone out there who's a 16, 17-year-old and their parents right now should be saying this is what the staff's going to be in 27 or 26. But knowing that James Franklin has a long-term contract, he's in year 12, and he's got a group that seems to like him enough to stick on campus and enjoy their situations enough to stick on campus, to pluck a guy like Knowles and throw him on top of that situation. Where are they right now from a staff prowess standpoint in selling the program and getting guys to believe in it? And that extends to the transfer portal.
Yeah, continuity is huge on a couple of different fronts. You see that these assistants are sticking around long term, and it's pretty easy to pick up on the fact that, and you see this on the player retention front as well when it comes to roster management. James Franklin has created a culture and an environment that players and coaches, they want to be part of. For not just 1 year either, not just a short-term thing. They want to be part of it for a long term. And when it comes to coaches and keeping those guys around, and same with roster retention as well, is money a factor? Yeah, it would be burying our heads in the sand if we said otherwise. But these guys, they wouldn't come back to Penn State as often as they do, and they wouldn't stick around in State College as long as they do if Franklin and the staff did not cultivate an environment, a culture that people truly want to be part of. That's something that resonates with recruits. And then, of course, and this kind of goes without saying, continuity with position coaches is huge. That's who these guys lean on throughout their recruitment. That's who they get to know the best. They obviously get to know James Franklin pretty well, and they get to know the coordinators through their process as well. But when you look at prospects and what they value and what really hits home for them, a lot of the times it's the relationship with the position coach. And Penn State hasn't had really any sort of overturn there recently. Marcus Hagan's taking over at wide receivers coach is the most recent from a position coach perspective. So it's something that recruits, it doesn't necessarily come up in conversation. Some will bring it up. It's one of those things, though, it doesn't really need to be said because those guys love getting to know coaches when they're underclassmen all the way up until the time where they become upperclassmen, time for them to make a decision. They have 2, 3, in some cases, even 4-year relationships built in. That's something that only helps Penn State on the trail.
Before we talk recruiting, I just want to look big picture here. If Penn State's in a position to pay a coordinator more than $3 million, we know they're handsomely rewarding Andy Kotelnicki for his job as offensive coordinator. We know that when you're retaining this level of your roster, this level of your staff, finances are in a pretty good place right now for Penn State football. So when you look at what they may have within their arsenal for continued transfer portal efforts and trying to round out this roster, doing everything within their power as a collective staff to put this team in a championship position for 2025. Clearly, they're all in a lot of ways. So you're trying to find those pieces, potential starters, too deep guys. What's your read on where they are now, maybe compared to last winter? Because we are fresh off learning that Penn State has the hiring power to get a guy out of Columbus and make that a part of why he would be incentivized to leave Ohio State. This is a new territory for the conversation with Penn State, at least in this moment. How does that extend to enhancing this roster in the next few months?
People are bought in. They truly are, the whole locked in mantra that you see on social media right now. People are truly bought in and locked in at this point, and that trickles over to the financial aspect of this. And that buy-in is a direct correlation of Penn State being able to go out and get a guy like Knowles and be competitive in the transfer portal and keep some of your top players. These guys didn't stick around for free. Penn State, they take care of their guys. That's a priority. James Franklin wants to make the guys in his locker room happy. That is priority A, B, and C for him every single offseason. It's a big reason why Penn State is so strong on the player retention front. And we've got another transfer portal window coming up in the spring. I know that feels like it might be far away, but trust me, it is not. It's going to be here before we know it. And there are going to be some talented guys entering the portal. You're going to be looking at wide receiver as a place to upgrade. You're going to be looking maybe on defense at specific positions based on what Knowles likes, doesn't like out of certain fits. Maybe you make some moves there. You combine pedigree, recent success, and now Penn State showcasing a pretty blatant financial commitment to not just compete at the top of the Big Ten, but win national championships. It's only going to help you on a roster building front, and it's going to keep you competitive for some of the top talent in the sport, whether that be in the portal or through high school recruiting.
All right, let's jump into the future of Penn State football a little bit here. And it's been a little while since we really discussed recruiting because the transfer additions have been key. And by the way, everybody's here, right, Tyler? All six of those transfers are now with the program. We've got more coverage of that at Lions 24/7. We'll continue to get good feedback on how they're developing. We'll get a chance to see them on the practice field come March. They've got winter conditioning between now and then, acclimating themselves in the film room, in the weight room, in the classroom, of course, and we'll see what kind of impact you get. You're really taking a hard look at receiver now, of course, after saying goodbye to Harrison Wallace and Omari Evans to their own transfer journey with Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross coming on board. We discussed them quite a bit last week with Tyler and when we broke down this transfer class. But looking toward the future in recruiting, Tyler, the latest commitment came through this weekend. Tell us who he is, where he's going to play ball for Penn State, and ultimately why the time was right for him to make this move.
Yeah, South Jersey cornerback Julian Peterson made the call to jump on board. He plays for former Nittany Lions running back Bill Belton, who does a great job down at Winslow Township High. They're coming off a state championship. He has made that program one of the best in New Jersey as a whole in such a short period of time. Peterson is one of his best players. He missed a little bit of time as a junior, but when he was on the field, he was really, really good. He went both ways for Winslow, running back, corner. Penn State loves him at cornerback. They've been recruiting Peterson since he told me the 8th grade. That's when he first established any sort of relationship with anyone at Penn State. And for Peterson being recruited by the Nittany Lions, it was a dream come true. He really weighed heavily on the culture of the program and the loyalty of the program in his recruitment throughout his entire process. There are plenty of schools that offered early. Penn State was among them. They offered all the way back in the spring of 2023. Plenty of schools who offered early, who, they came and went as his recruitment progressed. Penn State was not one of them. They stuck with him the whole way, and they monitored his development quite closely. Terry Smith loved what he saw on that front. Peterson has the requisite length. He's not necessarily a burner at corner in terms of speed, but he's fast enough. He's athletic enough. He's going to make some plays. He's a physical kid, too. He loves getting physical in man coverage. He relishes the opportunity to come up and help out and run support, which is always a desired trait. So I think Peterson has rankings riser potential. Right now we have him as a high 3-star at 24/7. I think if maybe there's a little bit more junior film, we'd be having a different kind of conversation. I think as the spring rolls on, as the evaluation period takes place, maybe the narrative changes, but it's January. Looking at rankings and evaluating the quality of commitment, it's malpractice at this point. There's still so much that goes into the evaluation process and so long to go in the evaluation process. Julian Peterson's a really good player. Penn State's happy to have him on board, and I think if you're a Penn State fan, you should be quite pleased with this get. He's a solid prospect.
Top 10 player in the state of New Jersey, top 40 overall cornerback in the country. He'll get a chance to show what he's capable of doing on the camp circuit, which will get going here in the next couple of months. We'll see him this summer, I'm sure, on campus here in State College, where some work with Penn State staff, and then ultimately he'll get a chance to do some things with Winslow, chasing another state championship as a senior, and we'll monitor the rankings along the way. Penn State staff high on this. I get the sense that maybe this is another one of those guys who there could be a multi-pronged path for his Penn State future, a la Keaton Ellis, Zakee Wheatley, Lamont Payne, guys who have come to campus, played cornerback, have that length, have some of those physical traits that can help them at safety. And we've just seen them kind of start some of those guys off at cornerback, learn what it's like to live on an island, carry some of those coverage skills to the safety room. I'm not pegging Julian Peterson for the safety room right now, but to me, Tyler, he seems like a guy who kind of has multiple branches as a defensive back, and that's usually the case. We got a couple of those guys to monitor each and every cycle. The 2025 class has guys like that too, but this isn't someone that I think we can just say he's a cornerback or it's not going to work.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And that's not to say he's going to wind up at safety, because the goal is for him to play corner. But, he's already 6'2". He's just a shade over 6'2". He's around 175 pounds, trending towards 180. So depending on where he continues to go in his physical development, you could give him all the looks you want at corner. But all it takes, one practice, hey, let's get a look at safety. And then the guy winds up sticking there for the rest of his career. You just never know what's going to happen once these guys get to campus. And the fact of the matter is, and this is something that Penn State always makes crystal clear on the recruiting trail, is they look, once you get to State College, we're going to find the best fit for you. We are going to put you in positions to succeed, however that comes about. Whatever it takes to get these guys the best out of them, Penn State's going to do. The goal is Peterson play corner. You want Terry Smith's top targets, obviously, to take here in late January. If something changes down the road, so be it. We've had this conversation about plenty of guys who signed with Penn State in the 25 class. They just love the upside overall, and that applies to Julian Peterson.
There are 9 commitments in this class now, and from 7 different states, and it's the number 3 group in 24/7 Sports class of 2026 rankings nationally. Tyler, how much could they get a bump? I mean, we've seen Penn State's program get a bump after getting that breakthrough, getting to the playoff, winning a couple games, threatening to get to the national championship game on a big stage. Is there a potential here for Penn State's recruiting efforts and reach? And I'll mention the NIL capabilities, but they sure seem very comfortable to use that on team veterans versus a 17-year-old high school player. But is there a chance here where maybe this recruiting cycle has higher potential, has a higher ceiling than the last few? And I'll also mention they've gotten off to a really strong start in the state of Pennsylvania for building the foundation of this 2026 class. So they're handling business on home turf. And to me, it feels like they could really sprinkle in some region guys, some non-region guys. And if they have a reach in a way they have in the last few cycles, maybe they go from that, top 15 to top 10 range to clearly inside the top 10 come signing day next December.
Yeah, I could see that, and here's why. On-field results are what they are in recruiting. We always talk about it's not the end-all, be-all for a large majority of these kids. But facts are facts, and here's a fact. Penn State made the college football playoff semifinals. They were 1 game away from competing for a national title. You know what that shows recruits? Oh, crap, I can actually compete and win a national title at Penn State. I don't think that was something before the expanded playoff where Penn State found itself just on the outside looking in that recruits could kind of reflect upon. They saw Penn State in the semifinals. They saw Penn State being 1 game away from playing for it all, 1 win away from bringing home a national title. So now it's not a dream or a vision that the Penn State staff could sell. It's legitimate. There's substance now. They were 1 game away. All these kids know that. And they could be, and coaches love this on the recruiting trail, hey, you could be that missing piece. You could be part of the reason why we get over the top, why we get to that national title game, why we bring a national championship back to Happy Valley. So, again, it will never be the end-all, be-all. There's so much more that goes into it. But I think in this instance specifically, the on-field results can indeed lead to that kind of a bump.
All right, we got a few names that we wanted to get to because there was a lot of promising prospects on campus this past weekend. It was the initial junior day event of 2025. There'll be a lot of recruiting events to follow between now and the whiteout next fall, and we'll have it all covered for you at Lions247.com, specifically Tyler Calvaruso. I asked you to give us a few names here and explain maybe why we wanted to spotlight them. So take it for wherever you want to. with name number 1?
First, before that, man, we're already talking about next year's whiteout. Jeez.
We're always thinking about next year's whiteout. It's always on the mind.
We have to. But no, this weekend, it was a solid weekend for Penn State, far beyond the commitment of Julian Peterson. It was a big weekend on the defensive front, especially. Penn State had a lot of its top targets on defense on campus. Got to start with Kari Adams in that regard. Blue chip cornerback prospect out of Maryland. He's been shooting up the rankings ever since he earned that offer from the Nittany Lions during the summer after he worked out for Terry Smith and Anthony Poindexter. And Penn State's right there in this recruitment. I got the chance to catch up with Adams before his visit. He told me, hey, look, even before this trip, they're already one of my top schools. Adams caught up with Brian Doan after his visit, and the sentiment remained the same. Penn State has continued to do really well with him. He sees a fit in that secondary, likes the culture of the program, and really, he's one of those prospects who I think he's going to continue to rise, to be honest with you. I don't think he's the same player as Brandon Finney, but when you look at him from a rankings riser perspective, they're very similar in the jumps that they've made. Adams is honestly on an even more accelerated timeline in that regard. So really good player. Penn State's right there in the mix. Sticking with the secondary, and previously this wasn't going to be a conversation about the secondary, but Caden Gebhardt, top 24/7 target out of Ohio. Everyone knows the story by now. High school teammates and best friends with Ethan Grunkemeyer. Strong desire to team up with him at the next level. He was back on campus. Penn State continued to fare really well there. But the big thing to note from my conversation with Gebhardt is he was very open about the fact that the pitch is geared a little bit more towards safety at this point. It was previously a linebacker type role in Tom Allen's defense, and that's actually the role that is being pitched to him now that Allen is at Clemson. Gebhardt made it down there for a visit recently. But asking around, it seems like that's the only program that's in on Gebhardt as a linebacker. Penn State safety now, Wisconsin safety, Ohio State safety. It's a good fit for Gebhardt. He could do anything. He's very versatile, and he's open to doing really whatever anyone asks of him at the next level. So that change, of course, did not impact him at all. Loves James Franklin, loves the defensive staff. He found out about the Jim Knowles hire while he was actually at Ohio State for that national championship celebration that they had on Sunday. So Gebhardt's timeline, I would say, is most interesting to follow at this point. He's planning on cutting his list soon. He could take things into March. That opens the door for him to make spring practice visits elsewhere. Penn State will probably get him back to campus in spring if that's the timeline he sticks to, but we'll see. That's fluid. Now, going back to linebacker, Matthew Canoe from Virginia. Really, really good player. He's not the longest kid in the world, but he's athletic. He's still learning the linebacker position. He's a little bit newer to it, and that makes him very moldable for a guy like Dan Connor. So there's a lot to like there. He's high on Penn State. He's been pretty open in interviews with me. Penn State's his leader at this point, and he doesn't have anything else planned on the visit front. That could change. It's Monday. There's one weekend left for these guys to get out and make visits. But I know Canoe wants to get back to campus in the spring as well, and Penn State is pacing the pack at this point. Again, really, really good linebacker, and he has been part of that top-tier linebacker conversation when it comes to the board. And Terry Wiggins from Coatesville, he falls into that conversation as well. Back on campus, think Penn State continues to do well there. There has been a lot of buzz surrounding the Nittany Lions with Wiggins since Penn State offered during the fall. He's been a big riser overall, stock-wise. The offers have rolled in, so I don't get the sense he's necessarily in a rush, but I think those at Penn State are pretty confident that they have done well with him early on and will continue to do well. It's not just an in-state option. He's another guy who sees a fit. And then, he's the lone 2027 guy I want to talk about. But
I don't think you gave a position for Wiggins, another linebacker there, just because he's not a guy we frequently have discussed. I know Gebhardt's been someone we've been tracking for quite a long time. But Wiggins, an offered linebacker out of Coatesville Area High School, 2026 cycle. So a lot of defensive stuff, but I know we're going to finish here with a quarterback and one that's considered a top 100 passer in the entire nation.
Yeah, Wiggins is teammates with Max Hiller in the 2027 class, elite offensive tackle prospect. Those two are pretty tight. So that's something else as well. But sticking with those 27s, man, it's never too early to talk about quarterback recruiting. Penn State has its guy in the 26 class in Troy Huhn out of California. They closed on him early in the cycle. That has allowed the Nittany Lions to dedicate a lot of their time and energy to 2027 quarterback recruiting. And Peter Bork out of Massachusetts, top 100 talent, he's at the center of the conversation right now. Back on campus over the weekend. Had a really insightful visit. Really, really insightful visit from his takeaways. He learned a lot about Penn State's offense through an in-depth conversation with Andy Kotelnicki. He spent time with Drew Aller. He spent time with Ethan Grunkemeyer. Learned a lot about the inner workings of Penn State, what it's like to play quarterback at Penn State. Got some advice on his recruiting process as a whole. I think Michigan's going to have something to say right along with Penn State about Bork as this process continues to play out. But Penn State's doing really, really well here. Bork told me he's going to be back in the spring. He's fired up. And really his final takeaway sentiment from his visit was that it was a trip that continued to validate Penn State as one of his top choices and one of the top programs in college football, in his opinion. So all really, really positive feedback. And again, I know he's a 27. He was originally part of that 26 class. He reclassed in 27, but never too early to zone in on quarterback recruiting. That's what we're doing with Bork. And I can tell you that's what Penn State's doing.
Yeah, went with more of a long-term project type passer with Beckham Kritza in this 2025 class. More pedigree in those 2026 and maybe 2027 classes. If you were to add Bork or a player of his caliber, Hune, a top 100 player out of Southern California, committed for the 2026 cycle. Quarterback's always going to draw attention, and that 2027 class becomes a little bit more interesting, Tyler, because by the time they show up, we'll only be, we think, 1 year removed from the Drew Aller era versus what we thought might be a 2-year gap where you'd have a lot more figured out in that quarterback room. You only might have a 1-year audition period for whoever's going to step up next. So the 2027 quarterback recruit could show up to a very interesting situation in their own right. I think that's going to do it for this episode with you, Tyler. What's next that we need to be aware of on the recruiting trail? Because I know you'll take care of it over at Lions247.com.
Another junior day coming up this weekend. Already a solid group of confirmations over at Lions 24/7 on the Lions Pride board. So I definitely suggest checking that out. We're always going to have our feedback and plenty of coverage stemming from Penn State's final big recruiting weekend of the winter. And then after that, spring ball is going to be here before you know it. That means more visitors coming back to campus, and we're going to have you covered all the way, man. It's a fun time to be covering Penn State football. I can tell you that. And, we're in a good spot to keep this thing rolling, and looking forward to catching up with these guys coming out of the weekend.
Judging by this first month of 2025, outside of a tough Thursday evening down in South Florida, it's been a good time to be following Penn State football, and things are really, from a momentum standpoint, in a different area than what we've really witnessed at this point in the offseason. Of course, when you do what they did, bringing in Jim Knowles, we discussed on this podcast, that's going to move the needle quite a bit. Tyler Calvaruso does a great job covering recruiting, the transfer portal, and much more for us over at Lions247.com. Check all of his content. Make sure you're following him on social media. Tyler, we'll have you on again soon. Thanks for the perspective.
Looking forward to it, man. Thanks.
All right, great stuff, as always, from one of my colleagues over at Lions247.com. You'll hear from more of them in upcoming episodes. We have a lot more coming your way here on the podcast, and a lot more coming your way at Lions247.com. We are going to really get into this Jim Knowles hire. You'll have a lot of content regarding his addition to this staff. We do anticipate we'll get a chance here in the next week or so to be in a press conference setting with Penn State's new defensive coordinator. We will be in attendance, asking whatever questions we're able to, and we'll get you all the information that you are desiring over at the site. We'll talk about it on the podcast. We always pick up the conversation here, but if you really want to be following the nuts and bolts day to day, moment by moment, and it really was moment by moment the last couple of weeks, if you were following along on our message board, 30% off gets you in the door right now as a VIP subscriber, or just take a test drive, $1 for 1 month. For now, stepping aside, I am Tyler Donahue. Big thanks to Patrick Murphy from our Ohio State site here in 24/7 Sports, and Tyler Calvaruso. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.